Hi guys. So Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer spoke at length actually in Parliament on Monday about the new tier system, the end of the lockdown, and there was not a real back and forth as you normally see in Prime Minister's questions, but Keir Starmer presented his questions and Boris Johnson responded to them. So I'm just going to go through some of the points that Keir Starmer raised and if Boris Johnson responded to them and how he responded to them. So the first thing which was interesting was that Keir Starmer extended an olive branch to the Prime Minister. He talked about the Four Nations approach, but he did get in a bit of a dig at the Tory rebels and the growing rebellion within the Conservative Party. He knew that Boris Johnson needs the Labour Party in order to get many of these measures across the line, and Boris Johnson, of course, knows this too. Now, Boris Johnson responded pretty much with nothing. He just suggested that Keir Starmer wants to go into a lockdown, which is a lie. He also questioned if Keir Starmer supported the measures, even though Boris is facing this rebellion within his party. Once again, Boris living in another universe. He doesn't seem to understand the reality that he needs the Labour Party at this moment. Now, Starmer went on to talk about how risky it is going into these three-tier system because it failed before. And he also talked about the shifting of these tiers. So in the past, where one community could be in tier 1, they would shift into tier 2 and then maybe into tier 3. And is there a risk of that happening again, considering that there was this need to go into a tiered system? And then once after that, Sage suggested it was a bad idea, suggested an actual lockdown. Keir Starmer, we remember, suggested a lockdown. Boris Johnson resisted, and it was necessary to go into a lockdown eventually. Now, Boris Johnson didn't respond to this point at all. The next thing that Starmer talked about was he had some questions as before about the tiers, and he said that they're not trick questions. Boris Johnson didn't respond to this either. I think it was interesting that he did raise the point that they're not trick questions, that, these are legitimate questions. Now, Starmer did talk about the areas of the tiers, what would be the standard, how they are determined. We saw how Tory MPs in certain areas where there were in certain lower tiers, and they were actually able to pressure the government to ease restrictions, to move them from maybe tier 3 to tier 2 or from tier 2 to tier 1 against the scientific evidence. Now, Boris responded by explaining the mechanisms on how the tiers would be selected or how they would be implemented. So he talked about detection rates in all groups, for example, age groups affected, and the pressure on the local NHS. Now, the problem I have with this is, surely if there is pressure on the NHS at the moment, it must be very low if you're ending the lockdown. Why are you ending the lockdown if there's still pressure on the NHS? This doesn't make any sense. And I've talked before how this date, the 2nd of December, is arbitrary. It doesn't seem to be following the science. Surely you would wait until you have the numbers down significantly and then you would ease the lockdown. You would not just in some arbitrary way move from a lockdown into a tiered system. Now, Keir Starmer went on to talk about how it's important that the planning is clear and quick. So what is the message to those who are in restrictions before the lockdown was imposed? So there were many areas that were in tier 3 restrictions. They went into the full lockdown. What's going to happen to those people after? Boris Johnson didn't respond to this either. Now, Starmer went on to say that the tiers, are they going to be imposed by the government, or are the government going to involve local administrations? Now, we remember Manchester and the King in the North, the conflict that took place between Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, and the local administration, because if you don't have them on board, it's going to make it much more difficult to impose any type of lockdown. Boris Johnson did actually respond to this. He did say, yes, we will work with local leaders, but he then said we need to take the decision at the end of the day. So it does look like it's going to be business as usual. Starmer also asked how long these tiers will last. Will it be weeks, months? With the lockdown, there was an arbitrary date. What's going to happen with these tiers? So Boris Johnson didn't explain how they would end. any mechanisms on how they would be ended. Just said that they were to be introduced and that they were necessary. Now, I think, once again, leaving it open-ended is okay, but if they're following certain criteria, I think you have to be honest with the public and explain the criteria. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to maintain their support. Starmer also asked about funding. What will be the funding in these areas that are under restriction for individuals? For example, the furlough scheme we know is going to continue, but what is the support for the businesses and in particular the self-employed? To which Boris Johnson did not reply. Now, Starmer also talked about test, trace and isolate not working. Testing was focused on, but not tracing and isolating. This meant that people were wandering around, not being told to isolate, which helped the spread. Now, Starmer suggested that Boris Johnson has abandoned trace and isolate for some moonshot or some new test, but this is fundamental in dealing with the pandemic. And it seems to be the case. Boris Johnson moves from one new toy to the next one, and he's not actually focusing on fixing the one that he has. Boris did sort of, in a sense, respond to this, but he used it as an excuse to make a false claim about Starmer attacking test and trace. Boris made no mention of isolate. He keeps mixing up testing and tracing as well. He keeps using the line that the UK is testing more than any other country in Europe. This is not the point. The point is it working? It doesn't matter how many tests you carry out. If it's not working, then the number is irrelevant. He also introduced another silver bullet instead of actually improving the current system. Starmer also reiterated the fact that he's not attacking workers of the test and trace system, but holding the government account when it comes to the risk. Boris Johnson, of course, didn't respond to this. Starmer finally finished with asking how confident is Boris Johnson that these measures will actually reduce the R number, the theme being risk and uncertainty. Boris Johnson didn't actually respond to the comment, but he did say something to the line of his support when he's talking about Keir Starmer. His support is sort of, now you see it, now you don't. A typical join me until I throw you under a bus. Completely, once again, ignoring the fact that Labour is propping up the Prime Minister, even though the latter has an 80-seat majority. So while there are some new measures brought in under this new tier system, I'm quite sceptical of it because of the arbitrary lockdown date. Why is that lockdown date ending on the 2nd of December if you're not following the science? So I just want to say finally that I'm looking forward to Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, because I much prefer that type of format where there's a back and forth between the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister. This format we had on Monday allows the Prime Minister basically to avoid a lot of the questioning. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.